You turn 30. Nothing changes physically overnight. You wake up the morning after your birthday with the same face, the same body, the same bank account, the same habits. Nothing dramatic has occurred. And yet, something has shifted in the social environment around you, quietly and without announcement, in a way that most men do not fully register until they encounter it in the specific friction of their relationships and their romantic life. The tolerance for unfinished has contracted. Before 30, the world extended you something that it did not label explicitly, but that shaped every interaction you had. The benefit of the doubt. The assumption that what you are right now is a draft, that the real version is coming, that the chaos or the stagnation or the lack of clear direction is a phase with a defined endpoint rather than a defining characteristic. Before 30, potential was a legitimate currency. People invested in you on the basis of what you might become. After 30, the currency changes. You are no longer being evaluated on what you might become. You are being evaluated on what you have become. Not cruelly, not unfairly, at least not by any standard that is not also applied to women as they age through their own set of evolving social expectations, but definitively. The social and romantic environment around a man over 30 is reading patterns rather than promises, habits rather than intentions, results rather than potential. And the women in that environment, whether they are consciously aware of it or not, are applying a different filter to what they observe. Today we are going to look directly at what that filter is. What women actually think about men over 30. Not what the polite social conversation suggests they think, but what the psychology, the evolutionary architecture, and the real lived experience of women navigating partner assessment in their late 20s and 30s actually produces in terms of how they evaluate the men they encounter. This is not a conversation designed to create pressure. Pressure is the enemy of the clarity this conversation is trying to produce. This is a conversation designed to give you an accurate map of the terrain you're operating in, so that you can navigate it with deliberate intelligence, rather than reactive confusion. Start with the foundational principle. Before 30, you are judged on promise. After 30, you are judged on patterns. That shift is everything. Promise is an assessment of potential based on incomplete information, weighted toward optimism, because the timeline for the potential to materialize is still open. It is the evaluation that a young man benefits from when his ambition exceeds his achievement, when his direction is still being determined, when his character is still being formed. Promise is generous. It gives you the gap between where you are and where you could go, and says the gap itself is evidence of something. Patterns are different. Patterns are what your accumulated choices have produced by the time the timeline has been running long enough to constitute evidence. A 32-year-old man has been making decisions for a decade of adult life. The financial position he is in reflects a decade of financial decisions. The physical condition he is in reflects a decade of choices about how to treat his body. The emotional maturity he exhibits reflects the degree to which he has done, or not done, the internal work that emotional development requires. The career trajectory he is on reflects a decade of professional choices. All of that is visible. All of it is evaluable. And women over a certain age evaluate it with a precision that the same women would not have applied, and did not have the data to apply to men at 22. This is not women becoming harsher. It is the natural consequence of timeline. When the timeline gets longer, the patterns become visible. When the patterns become visible, the assessment becomes more accurate. And more accurate assessment means less tolerance for the gap between stated intention and demonstrated behavior. The evolutionary layer of this sits underneath the conscious assessment in ways that are worth understanding directly. Long-term mate selection and psychology in women is oriented primarily towards stability signals. Not stability as a static condition, but stability as the evidence of underlying competence, the demonstrated capacity to acquire resources, maintain emotional reliability, and provide the kind of consistent investment that long-term partnership and family formation require. These are not arbitrary preferences. They are the outputs of a selection architecture that evolved because they were functionally important in environments where the stakes of partner choice were a survival level. At 22, instability in a man is tolerated with a generosity that reflects the realistic recognition that 22-year-olds are frequently unstable and that the instability often resolves. The timeline ahead is long enough that the instability can be understood as developmental rather than definitional. At 32, the same instability reads differently. It has had a decade to resolve and has not, which means the assessment shifts from this is probably temporary to this may be who he is. And who he is matters in long-term selection, in a way that who he might become does not need to be taken as seriously. The risk assessment logic here is important and worth naming directly. Women evaluating potential long-term partners are not making emotional calculations in isolation. They are running a risk assessment in which the quality of the choice they make has long-term implications for their own trajectory, their own security, and in many cases their reproductive timeline. That assessment becomes more careful, not less, as the stakes of getting it wrong become higher with age, and as the remaining time for correction becomes shorter. The increased selectivity that men encounter from women in their late 20s and 30s is not a shift in fundamental values. It is the rational tightening of an assessment process in response to increasing stakes. Let's look at the split that becomes visible after 30, because it is one of the most important dynamics to understand if you want an accurate picture of how you are being perceived. There are, broadly speaking, two types of men over 30 that women observe in the modern dating environment. The categories are not absolute, and most men have elements of both in different domains of their lives, but the broad pattern is real and consistently recognizable. The first type is the man who has been building. He has not necessarily achieved everything he intended to achieve by 30, but the trajectory is visible, and it is upward. His financial position may not be exceptional, but it is organized and directional. His physical condition reflects consistent investment rather than neglect. His emotional responses are regulated in ways that communicate that he has done work on himself. His social network reflects genuine relationships rather than the residue of proximity. When you ask him about his direction, he has an answer that is specific and that his behavior supports. He is not perfect. But the pattern of his choices communicates something consistent. This is a man who is taking his own life seriously. The second type is the man who has been coasting. The trajectory is flat or declining. The financial position at 32 looks essentially the same as it did at 25, without the organizational difference that progression would produce. The physical condition reflects a decade of deferred investment. The emotional responses are still reactive in ways that have not been modulated by the self-awareness that genuine maturity produces. The social network is a mix of people he has kept from earlier phases of life and new acquaintances who share primarily surface-level consumption habits. When you ask about direction, the answer is vague, optimistic, in a way that is untethered from specific action, and inconsistent with what his observable choices suggest about where his actual priorities are. The critical thing to understand is that after 30, women can tell the difference between these two types reliably and quickly, not because they are applying a harsh judgment, because the evidence is now present in the form of visible, accumulated patterns. You cannot fake trajectory at 32 the way you could intimate potential at 22. The patterns are there for anyone paying attention to read. The question that women over approximately 25 are consistently running is not always verbalized, but is always present in the assessment. Is he building or coasting? And the answer to that question, derived from behavioral evidence rather than stated intention, shapes everything that follows in terms of how she perceives and evaluates the man in front of her. Now let's look at what specifically attracts women more after 30, because the answer is different from what attracts them at 22. And the difference is important. At 22, excitement is the primary currency. The energy of unpredictability, the intensity of raw charisma, the novelty that comes from someone who is still figuring out who they are and generating interesting turbulence in the process. Excitement at that age reads as vitality. It feels like aliveness. The chaos and the charm and the intensity are compelling because the stakes of attachment are still relatively low and because the biological and social timeline for long-term decisions still feels open. By the late 20s and early 30s, the currency shifts. Emotional steadiness becomes more attractive than emotional intensity, not because emotional intensity ceases to matter, but because the woman doing the assessment has accumulated enough relational experience to understand the cost of emotional volatility over time. The man who was exciting because of his unpredictability was also exhausting because of it. The man who generated the intense feelings also generated intense anxiety. The appeal of that trait starts to look different when you've lived through it a few times, and when the timeline for making long-term decisions is no longer as theoretically open as it was. Leadership becomes more attractive than loudness. The man who commands a room through genuine presence, through the calm authority that comes from actually knowing who he is and what he is doing, is more compelling to the what the mature female assessment than the man who commands attention through volume and performative confidence, Genuine leadership is quiet in a specific way. It does not need to announce itself. It is simply visible in how a man carries himself, how he makes decisions, how he maintains his orientation and under pressure. That quality takes years to develop and is recognizable to people who have developed enough observation to see past surface performance. Direction becomes more attractive than charm. Charm is a social skill. It is learnable, deployable, and visible in the first 15 minutes of an interaction. Direction is a life characteristic. It is the accumulation of choices over time that points consistently in a coherent trajectory. The woman who is assessing a potential long-term partner is not primarily asking whether he is charming. She is asking whether he has a direction that she can see herself alongside. And direction cannot be performed in the way that charm can. It is either present in the pattern of his choices, or it is not. Reliability becomes more attractive than raw excitement. The man who does what he says consistently, who shows up for the commitments he makes in the relationship and in his life broadly, who generates the kind of confidence that comes from demonstrated trustworthiness rather than from bold promises, is deeply compelling to a woman who has learned through experience what it costs when reliability is absent. Now let's look at what raises red flags, because this is the information that men over 30 most consistently underestimate in terms of its impact on how they are perceived. Living without visible progression is the most universally recognized red flag in this age group, and not the absence of extraordinary achievement, the absence of any meaningful direction. The man whose financial, professional, and personal situation looks essentially unchanged from several years ago, who is not actively pursuing anything, who has rationalized stagnation as contentment without the internal infrastructure that genuine contentment requires, registers as risk. The risk is specific. This is a man who will not bring growth energy to a partnership. He will require maintenance rather than generating contribution. Chronic job instability after 30 reads differently than it does at 25. At 25, it can be adventurousness, the willingness to take risks in the pursuit of the right fit. At 33, without a visible rationale that is clearly developmental rather than evasive, it reads as an inability or unwillingness to maintain the kind of sustained commitment that long-term anything requires. Not always correctly. Context matters. But the default reading of unexplained chronic instability at this age has shifted. Emotional volatility is a significant and rapidly registered red flag in the post-30 assessment. Overreactions to minor friction. Defensive responses to straightforward feedback. The inability to sit with discomfort without externalizing it as someone else's failing. These patterns communicate something specific about a man's internal architecture that is directly relevant to how he will function as a long-term partner. A woman who is considering building a life with someone needs to be able to assess whether that person can remain regulated under the actual stresses of sustained partnership, of financial difficulty, of relational conflict, of the genuine complexity that shared life produces. Emotional volatility in low-stakes situations is a reliable indicator that high-stakes situations will be managed worse. Avoidance of responsibility is equally visible and equally significant. The man who consistently positions himself as the victim of circumstances rather than the agent of his own outcomes, who has explanations for everything that went wrong that locate the failure externally, who cannot acknowledge his own role in the patterns of his life, is demonstrating an absence of the self-awareness that emotional maturity requires. Partnership requires two people who can take accountability. A man who cannot take accountability for his own life cannot be a reliable partner in navigating the challenges of a shared one. The excessive partying lifestyle at 33 is not itself the problem. The problem is what it signals about priorities. The man who is still organizing his social life primarily around the same patterns that characterized his early 20s without having developed the depth of interests, relationships, and engagement that should have accumulated over a decade is communicating through his lifestyle choices that he has not grown in ways that long-term partnership selection values. Not that fun is wrong, that the absence of depth behind the fun, at this age and this stage, is a pattern worth reading. After 30, what were phases were become patterns, and patterns communicate who a man is, not who he might become. Now let's make this tactical, because the diagnosis is only useful if it produces something actionable. The first rule, build visible trajectory, not just internal ambition. Women do not need the man they are evaluating to be at the destination. They need to see genuine movement toward one. The distinction is crucial because it means that your current position is less important than the direction your current position is moving in. A man with a modest income who is clearly building towards something, whose choices consistently prioritize development over consumption, whose skills and capabilities are visibly expanding, projects a trajectory that is compelling. A man with a higher income who appears to have plateaued, whose choices have stopped being developmental and have become primarily consumptive, projects a stagnation that is concerning regardless of the current number. Visibility matters here in a specific way. Trajectory that is invisible does not function as a signal. The internal ambition you carry, the plans you are working through, the development you are investing in, that has not yet produced visible external results. None of that is available to someone making an external assessment of your situation. What they can see is what your choices, your habits, your physical condition, your professional positioning, and your social presence communicate. If the internal trajectory is real, it needs to be expressed in external evidence that is observable. If it is not yet producing observable evidence, the gap between your internal experience and the external signal you are projecting is a communication problem worth addressing. The second rule: develop emotional control as a genuine capacity, not a performance. Emotional steadiness after 30 is rare enough to be immediately remarkable. The man who remains calm under pressure, who responds to conflict without escalating it, who can receive critical information without becoming defensive, who maintains his equilibrium in situations that would destabilize less grounded men, is projecting a quality that is both highly attractive and deeply reassuring to a woman assessing long-term partnership potential. The critical qualifier is genuine. Performed emotional control, the suppression of reactive responses without the internal regulation that makes the suppression natural, is detectable. It tends to break down under sustained pressure, producing the specific pattern of someone who seems fine until they are not fine, in a way that is more unsettling than consistent volatility because it introduces uncertainty into what the real baseline is. Genuine emotional regulation is the output of internal work. The development of self-awareness, the practice of responding rather than reacting, the cultivation of psychological stability that does not require external circumstances to be favorable in order to remain intact. That is not a short-term project. It is the accumulated output of genuine self-development. The third rule: own your age rather than performing youth. There is a specific and highly visible pattern that appears in men at 30 and beyond who have not fully integrated the reality of where they are in their life stage. The performance of youth. The attempt to occupy social spaces and project social energies that belong to a younger version of themselves rather than to the actual men they are. The trying to out-party 23-year-olds at 33. The social media presence organized around the performance of a lifestyle that is not authentic to a man at his actual stage of development. The relational positioning that emphasizes excitement and novelty over depth and stability in ways that feel internally incongruent and are externally readable as insecurity. The signal this sends is the opposite of what it intends. It does not read as vitality or relevance. It reads as an unwillingness to occupy the identity that this age, properly developed, actually offers. And that unwillingness is a form of insecurity that is more visible and more damaging to attractiveness than simply being 33 and owning it completely. The depth that genuine maturity produces when it has been developed rather than avoided is more compelling than any performance of youth can achieve. The man at 33 who owns his age, who brings the confidence and the presence and the directional clarity that a decade of serious adult development should have produced, is not competing with 23-year-olds. He is operating in a category that 23-year-olds cannot access because they have not lived long enough to develop what he has built. Depth beats novelty. Confidence beats forced relevance. Owning your actual stage beats performing a stage you have already passed. Now let's talk about the power dynamic shift that the post-30 period creates for men who have built correctly, because this is the part of the conversation that most men over 30 do not have access to, and that represents a genuine and significant opportunity. If you have invested seriously in your 20s, financially, physically, in terms of skill development and emotional maturity and social positioning, the post-30 period is not when your attractiveness begins to decline. It is when it peaks. Here is why. The qualities that become more attractive to women in their late 20s and early 30s, the emotional steadiness, the directional clarity, the financial organization, the calm authority that comes from genuine self-knowledge, are qualities that take time to develop. They cannot be convincingly faked. They cannot be purchased or performed into existence. They are the output of the years of investment, which means the man who has made those investments enters his 30s at exactly the moment when the market for the qualities he has developed is expanding rapidly. Income at this stage, for the man who has been building, has stabilized at a level that produces genuine optionality. Financial optionality changes behavior in ways that are visible. The man who does not need any specific outcome has a different quality of engagement in every interaction than the man who needs the outcome. That quality is calm, non-desperate, genuinely selective. It is extremely compelling to the same perceptual system that reads need as reduced value. Confidence at this stage, for the man who has developed it through genuine accomplishment rather than through the performance of bravado, has a different quality than the confidence of younger men. It is quieter. It does not need to announce itself. It is simply present in how he carries himself, how he speaks, how he makes decisions, how he handles situations that would destabilize the man who has not yet developed this particular form of settled self-knowledge. Network at this stage has expanded in ways that constitute genuine social capital. The people a man in his mid-30s knows, the professional contacts, the genuine friendships, the community of people who respect him and are actively endorsed by him through their association, is a social proof signal that generates its own form of attractiveness independent of his individual presentation. The combination of these factors, when they have been genuinely built rather than performed, produces a version of male attractiveness that the dating market over 30 rewards in ways that it cannot reward before 30, because the components required to produce it simply had not had enough time to develop. But only if the investment was made. This is the conditional that matters. The man who did not make the investments in his 20s arrives at 30 with the same absence of those qualities that he had at 25, but now without the benefit of the promise that made the absence forgivable earlier. The man who made the investments arrives at 30 with the compounded output of a decade of serious self-development. The gap between those two positions, which was modest at 25, is enormous at 35. Why do some women become more selective as they age, and why does that selectivity affect men over 30 in specific ways? The selectivity is not arbitrary, and it is not hostility. It is efficiency. The woman in her late 20s and early 30s has a clearer sense of what she actually needs in a long-term partner than she did at 22. She has accumulated enough relational experience to understand her own patterns, to recognize the attachment styles that produce bad outcomes for her, to distinguish between the initial excitement of a new connection and the sustainable compatibility that long-term partnership requires. That accumulated knowledge produces more precise standards, and more precise standards mean that the early screening process is more aggressive in filtering out what does not meet them. The time dimension also intensifies the selectivity. For women who are considering long-term partnership and family formation on a timeline that has biological constraints, the period of the late 20s and early 30s is one where the efficiency of partner selection genuinely matters in ways it did not earlier. This produces a decisiveness in the assessment process that can feel abrupt to men who are accustomed to the more gradual and forgiving evaluation processes of younger years. The woman who ends the third date without ambiguity because she has determined what she needed to determine is not being harsh. She is being precise. Understanding that selectivity as efficiency, rather than as hostility, changes how you relate to it. You are not being rejected, in some absolute sense. You are being assessed against a set of criteria that has become more specific by someone whose assessment process has become more efficient. The question worth asking is not whether the standards are fair, it is whether you are genuinely meeting them. There is a pressure pattern that many men experience after 30 that deserves direct attention because it is both common and self-defeating. The internal dialogue of the man who has not built as much as he intended by 30 tends to run in a specific direction. I should be further along. I am behind where I am supposed to be. Time is running out. The urgency has arrived, and I have not done what was needed to meet it. That internal dialogue is understandable, but it produces a specific psychological state, a combination of insecurity, urgency, and comparison anxiety that leaks into social behavior in ways that compound the original problem. Insecurity is visible. It changes communication patterns in ways that produce exactly the qualities that the post-30 assessment finds most unfavorable. The urgency to appear more developed than you are produces a performance quality in social interactions that is detectable and that reads as the opposite of the genuine groundedness it is trying to simulate. The comparison anxiety produces the kind of overinvestment and validation seeking that are the primary drivers of the approval-seeking behavior that erodes attractiveness most consistently. The pressure that the 30 threshold creates when it is not met with genuine development tends to produce a set of behaviors that make the development harder rather than easier to pursue. which means the answer to the pressure is not to feel it more intensely or to perform against it more aggressively. The answer is to redirect the energy the pressure is generating into the actual work of building the qualities that would make the pressure irrelevant. The dating market reality after 30, particularly in the context of the technological environment that currently mediates a significant portion of romantic contact, is more competitive in specific ways that men over 30 need to understand clearly. The visibility that social media and dating applications create means that the comparison set for any individual woman making partner assessments is far broader than it would have been in a pre-digital environment. She is not comparing the men she is considering to the men in her immediate local social circle. She is comparing them to a curated global sample. The men who appear most prominently in that sample are disproportionately high in exactly the signals that the post-30 assessment values most, which means the implicit standard against which any specific man is being compared has been shifted upward by the technological environment in ways that are not visible in any individual interaction, but that affect the baseline assessment threshold. The response to this is not despair, and it is not resentment of the technology. It is the recognition that disciplined investment in genuine quality, in actual development rather than performed development, is more important in this environment than it was in any previous one. Because the comparison set is global and curated, surface level performance is less effective than it has ever been. The qualities that genuinely distinguish a man in this environment are the ones that cannot be easily replicated because they are the output of years of real investment, which is a different kind of competition than the one that existed before the technology changed the reference pool. The philosophical distinction between age and value is where this conversation ultimately lands, because it is the frame that determines whether everything we have discussed produces clarity or panic. Age alone means nothing. A man at 35 is not more or less attractive because of the number. He is more or less attractive based on what the number represents in terms of the choices that produced it. 35 years of consistent investment in genuine self-development, financial discipline, emotional maturity, and physical health produces a version of a 35-year-old man that occupies a categorically different position than 35 years of drift and avoidance and deferred development. Value compounds. The man who's been building since 22 arrives at 35 with 13 years of compound interest on every investment he has made, 13 years of consistent physical training, 13 years of financial discipline, 13 years of emotional development and the self-awareness that comes from genuinely working on yourself, 13 years of professional investment that has produced real skills, real reputation, real network. The man at 35 who has built that stack is not competing with younger men on the dimensions where youth has an inherent advantage. He is competing on dimensions where his age is itself evidence of the quality he has developed. Some men decline after 30. The habits that could be maintained in the resilient metabolism of youth cannot be sustained on the same energy when the body and mind require more deliberate investment to remain at the same level. The man who has not built discipline around health and development discovers that the natural decline of youth-dependent vitality is not compensated by anything he has built to replace it. Some men accelerate after 30. The compound interest on the investments of the previous decade starts becoming fully visible. The discipline that was building quietly produces the kind of confident, grounded, capable presence that is extremely compelling at exactly the moment when the market for those qualities is expanding. The man who built finds that 30 is not a deadline, but a reveal. The reveal of what his choices have actually produced. And if the choices have been serious, the reveal is genuinely impressive. The women who are assessing men over 30, with the clarity and efficiency that their own development has given them, are asking questions that resolve to a few core inquiries. Is he stable? Is he growing? Can I trust his direction? Those are the questions that the assessment is designed to answer. The man who can answer them with behavioral evidence, with the visible pattern of his choices rather than the stated intention of his words, is the man who benefits from the post-30 shift rather than being penalized by it. 30 is not old. 30 is not a decline. It is an exposure. Everything you have been building or everything you have been avoiding becomes visible. Your discipline shows. Your habits show. Your trajectory shows. The character you have developed or failed to develop over the first decade of serious adult life is no longer a theoretical projection of what you might become. It is an observable pattern of what you have chosen to be. The right people, the women who are themselves developed enough to read those patterns accurately and who are seeking the qualities that genuine development produces, will notice. Not because you sold them potential, because you demonstrated proof. Build proof. Own your age. Invest in the qualities that compound. And let the pattern of your choices speak for itself, because after 30 it will.